Trump looks like he's cruising to win the nomination. That much we know. However, there's a lot that we really don't know. In terms of the primaries and the caucuses that are coming up, there's a lot to determine between who will win, if Trump's going to win, if he's going to roll over the rest of the competition, or if Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, or Vivek Ramaswamy can maybe mount a last-second challenge to him in some states to potentially prolong the primary or to even take the nomination themselves. So let's get into it. First off, we have to kind of summarize the candidates. Where have they gone since the start of the campaign? Well, first off, of course, we have the front runner and the front runner for the entire length of this campaign, even when he was not officially a candidate, Donald Trump. Trump has spent most of the primary trying to make it almost not a primary. He's been saying that they don't need to have debates, they don't need to have primaries or caucuses, and that they should just acknowledge that he's going to win. And for the most part, while you can argue that his actions not going to a debate or calling for the end to primaries and caucuses are undemocratic, you can also see that he's kind of right in a way. He has 60% of the national support right now, according to current polls, and even in states where his opponents have done a large portion of campaigning, particularly in Iowa and New Hampshire, he's still polling near 50% in both of those, and 50% is really all you need to win. Remember, Trump won the 2016 primary with only around 45% of the total vote, and a lot of that vote came after all his opponents dropped out, including big states like California. So really, he won with probably around 35 to 40% support, and he's currently at 60. So, of course, that is a big, big thing for Trump.
I am inevitable.
Now, there are two main challengers to the current Trump campaign. It's between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. Let's first start with Ron DeSantis. Now, DeSantis originally was seen as the biggest competitor to Trump. If you look at the polls, this is from 538, you could see Trump was actually polling near even with Trump, or he was pretty close behind, at least until around April. Now, from April, Trump began to attack DeSantis, who had earlier been his erstwhile supporter. And DeSantis has never really been able to attack Trump. See, in the Republican primary, when Trump attacks a different candidate, those who support Trump, or even those who don't support Trump but are generally just considering themselves Republicans, tend to like that candidate less. However, if an opposing candidate attacks Trump, that tends to solidify Trump's support from his base. And that has been a huge problem for all of those who have tried to make the case that Trump is not the person who should be leading the Republican Party into the next presidential election. And particularly with Ron DeSantis, who has tried to form a middle way between Trump and the more outspoken anti-Trump elements of the Republican Party, such as at least Nikki Haley and especially more so Chris Christie. And DeSantis' strategy of being in the middle of this question of how Trumpy are you has really allowed him to lose a lot of support, particularly from college-educated voters and suburban voters who have begun drifting away from the Republican Party since 2016.
But this ship can't sink.
However, his stance hasn't exactly endeared him to the "we like Trump, but maybe we're willing to go with someone else" party, and that's really hurt him as he's lost support from both the right and the left flanks of his support base. Now, Nikki Haley has gone for a different type of strategy, more of an outside-in approach. If DeSantis' strategy was to appeal to those who moderately like Trump and then work on getting the people who hated Trump in the Republican Party later, Haley took the opposite strategy, first solidifying herself as the most formidable anti-Trump foe by knocking out Chris Christie, and later pivoting towards the center of the Republican Party's "how much do you like Trump" debate, and she's begun squeezing support from DeSantis and from a lot of other candidates who have recently dropped out, including Tim Scott, Doug Burgum, and others. Now, Nikki Haley has one crucial advantage, which none of the other candidates really have, which is strong support from a home state in the early states. Now, in the American presidential primary system, it's not just the whole nation elects their one candidate for each party. No. Each state has their own different day and their own different system for choosing the candidate that state thinks is the best candidate for that party. And it's a really complicated system. And at least in the Republican Party, there are 4 early states, notably Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa is happening this coming Monday, New Hampshire is the Monday after, and Nevada and South Carolina are a bit after. Now, Nikki Haley has always been able to pretty much guarantee that she'll be running at least through these first four states because she was actually the governor of South Carolina and maintains a lot of support in that state. And DeSantis and Ramaswamy are not really beneficiaries of this. DeSantis' home state and his main support base is in Florida, which votes much later. And Ramaswamy, despite being from Iowa, living in Iowa, he's never really had a particular connection to Iowans or Iowa in the same way that Nikki Haley has through her governorship of South Carolina or Trump has through his leadership of the National Party and time as president. Now, there are quite a few differences between a primary and a caucus. In a primary, it's held similar to a normal election. A voter will go to a vote booth. It will take about 5 minutes. They'll mark all their choices down for the primary on that given day, and they'll go home, and then the results will come out later that day, or if it's taking a while to count votes, later that week. Now, caucuses are very different. In a caucus, everyone from a given community, maybe it's a town, maybe it's a street, it could be a lot of different things depending on how dense the populations are, will go and they'll meet up at a certain meeting place. Maybe it's a school, maybe it's a church, could be a lot of different things. Once at this meeting place, caucus goers will then debate with each other over which candidate they believe they should support. For example, there may be a group of undecided voters sitting somewhere in, let's say, a school gym. Then maybe a Trump supporter will go over and try and convince them into supporting Trump. If they succeed and all these voters decide they want to support Trump in the caucuses, they'll go and stand with another group of Trump voters. Now, maybe a Haley voter comes over and tries to convince these Trump voters, and so on. And this endeavor will take quite a few hours, which is why caucuses typically take a lot more willpower and are very beneficial for candidates whose voters are typically considered grassroots and more extreme. And caucuses typically have lower turnout. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the primary in May 24th, 2016, with 52.4% of the vote to Bernie Sanders' 47.6% of the vote, with 802,000 votes cast. Now, in 2016's Washington Democratic caucuses, March 26th, 2016, Bernie Sanders won with 72.7% of the vote to Clinton's 27.1% of the vote. However, there were only 230,000 votes cast, and it could be said that this is because Bernie Sanders' voters were generally much more partisan and much more grassroots than Hillary Clinton's voters, and you'd probably be correct if you say that. And this isn't just a phenomenon in the Democratic primaries, but it's also a factor in the Republican ones. Now, first, we're just going to look at Nebraska's Democratic caucuses, also from 2016. You see a similar phenomenon. Hillary Clinton won 53.1% of the vote, narrowly defeating Bernie Sanders on the May 10th primary, which was non-binding. However, in the binding caucuses, there was less than half of the turnout, and Bernie Sanders won with 57.1% of the vote to Hillary Clinton's 42.9%. However, in both Nebraska and Washington, the winner of the caucuses was actually the winner with the most votes. The person with the most votes in the caucuses received the most delegates. However, this isn't always the case, and if one looks back to 2012 in the Republican caucuses, Rick Santorum won the caucuses with 24.56% of the vote, 29,000, almost 30,000 votes. Mitt Romney came in second, just behind, with literally 34 less votes, basically a tie between Rick Santorum and Mitt Romney. Ron Paul finished a little bit behind that with 26,000 votes, and so on. However, Ron Paul's supporters were considerably more grassroots and more activist than Romney or Santorum's supporters, which meant that when voters actually picked the delegates in Iowa, Ron Paul came away with 22 delegates, Mitt Romney with just 6, and Rick Santorum, who had actually won the caucuses on a popular vote margin, actually finished with 0 delegates. And that's always been a big danger, especially for larger campaigns. At the time, Rick Santorum wasn't exactly running a one-state campaign. He was running a national campaign, and Mitt Romney was as well. Both of them were also fighting in New Hampshire, South Carolina, and other states, just as many of the other main contenders at the time were. However, Ron Paul had really invested resources into Iowa to get that grassroots organization going, which led to him taking 22 delegates to Mitt Romney's 6 and Rick Santorum's 0. Now, moving on to the actual primary, there's a lot of differences between many of the early states. If you just look at the polls from 2016 and the exit polls, you could see that there are certain demographics which are way overrepresented in certain states. For example, 97% of the Republican primary in 2016 was white. 62% were evangelicals, 52% were men, and so on. And you can see that it's generally an older demographic of voters in the Iowa caucuses. 46% of them in 2016 were 55 to 64, and that's probably going to be a similar proportion this time. Likewise, we're probably going to see a lot of evangelical voters in Iowa as well, and it's probably going to be a very white caucus yet again. 97% probably isn't going to change that significantly. And that's why Trump has such an advantage in Iowa. If we look at the Iowa polls right now, Trump is polling roughly at 50%, and Haley, who's been narrowly catching up to DeSantis and recently passed him in a few polls, and DeSantis, they're both considerably lower. They're both polling at around 16%, maybe 17%, and Vivek Ramaswamy is just at 6%. Now, Trump hasn't really had to do much campaigning in Iowa. He's held just 30 events there. DeSantis has crisscrossed the entire state, as has Ramaswamy. Haley's been running more of a national campaign, or at least a two-state campaign between Iowa and New Hampshire. But she's also polling relatively even with DeSantis, and that's because of these demographics. Evangelical voters don't really like Nikki Haley, who they see as socially more moderate than Trump or DeSantis. And that also goes for men who typically favor both DeSantis and Trump, and so on. Now, if we begin to go to the other states, it's going to be a little bit different. But first, we have to take a hold of what is Iowa. Why is Iowa such favorable territory for Donald Trump? Well, first off, it's got a lot of farmers and a lot of farmland. Now, Iowa is one of the main farm states. You can see Iowa right here on the map. It's very green, green being the percentage of land area that is farmed. The greener it is, the more farmland there is. And you can see Iowa is very much a farm state, which is a state that Trump has done well in the past, and it's a group that Trump continuously does well with, and likewise for DeSantis. However, Haley's prevailed mainly among the more educated suburbanites who don't really exist anymore in the Iowa Republican Party. There's also a massive blizzard happening. Iowa is projected to have wind chill that's going to bring the temperature down to it feels like of around negative 20, negative 30, maybe even negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And Iowa being a large farming state, that's going to be a huge issue for many caucus goers who are going to have to decide if they can take the risk that they could go out and caucus for 4 hours, unlike a primary where you would vote for maybe 5-10 minutes. They have to wait 4 hours to go out and caucus. Are they able to do that when they have maybe farm animals who can't be left outside for 4 hours and they have to take care of them? How are they going to do that? That's a big issue for Iowa. A lot of candidates, including Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, DeSantis, they've all been saying we need everyone to turn out, and they're getting worried as the storm continues in Iowa, and it will still be there tomorrow. Now, New Hampshire is a very different state. If you look on this map again for the farmland, New Hampshire is not a farming state. And New Hampshire also is quite educated. If you look at the total vote, 77% are non-evangelical, which is a demographic Haley does well in. 54% are suburban, 53% are college graduates. Those are all demographics that Nikki Haley does well in. And if we remember, 77% are non-evangelical in New Hampshire. Well, in Iowa, it's almost the complete opposite. 62% are evangelical. So that's why you're seeing such a difference in the polling. Now, if we know that DeSantis has a large strength with evangelicals, and likewise for Trump, it's not really a surprise that Haley, who does well with non-evangelicals, is polling considerably closer to Trump in New Hampshire, and DeSantis is polling considerably lower. In fact, in the recent polls, we've actually been seeing Nikki Haley just 7 percentage points behind Trump. And this was when Chris Christie, the most anti-Trump candidate in the race, was still in it. And he was getting around 12%. So if Chris Christie has now dropped out, you can expect a lot of these voters to choose Nikki Haley, potentially making New Hampshire a very, very competitive state. Now, we can't make predictions just yet in New Hampshire, just because Chris Christie is dropping out hasn't exactly transpired yet. There's a lot of work to be done in New Hampshire to figure out if Haley's going to win or Trump's going to win. Furthermore, New Hampshire's a primary, and not only is it just a normal primary, but it's actually an open primary, meaning independents can still vote in New Hampshire. Now, while Trump is crushing Haley among Republicans in New Hampshire, there are more independents than Republicans in New Hampshire, and with the Democrats now having a close presidential campaign, it's likely that many of these independents would choose to vote in the Republican primary, and they're very solidly behind Haley, which is driving Haley's rise in the polls. While Trump still looks to be the favorite to win New Hampshire, it's really too close to call. Now for the last of the close early states. We have South Carolina. Now, in between New Hampshire and South Carolina, Nevada will vote in both the primary and a caucus. However, this state isn't really seen to be close. Nevada's GOP state party is actually very Trump heavy, and they've maneuvered a lot of the rules, so that is going to be extraordinarily unlikely for any candidate other than Trump to do well. However, South Carolina isn't that. While South Carolina has a generally Trumpy state GOP, it's not changed any of its rules for the primary or caucus, in this case, a primary. And as you can see from the demographics, it looks to be a state similar to New Hampshire. If we go back to the farmland, you can see there's a little bit of farmland in South Carolina, but it's not quite Iowa, and it's not quite New Hampshire. It's kind of in between, and this is where Nikki Haley is going to really have to do well. It's 67% evangelical, which is a very high proportion. 73% of the voters are 45 plus, which is once again a strong demographic for Trump and for DeSantis. However, it's also quite suburban. 50% of the Republican primary in 2016 was suburban, and it's got quite a few richer voters relative to some of the other states. 26% of the South Carolina primary in 2016 made between 100,000 and 199,000, which is a very, very good number for Nikki Haley because she generally does well with more affluent Republicans. So we're going to have to wait and see. We have Iowa coming up tomorrow, the 15th, on Monday. We have, just after that, we have New Hampshire next week. And then we move on to Nevada, South Carolina, and then Super Tuesday. So, my predictions right now. I think that Iowa is going to go for Trump with around 50% of the vote. I think Haley is going to get around 18% of the vote. We'll say DeSantis getting 15%, Ramaswamy at around 7 to 8%. Now, for New Hampshire, I think it's going to be much closer. I think Trump's going to get around 40%. I think Haley's going to get 38, 39, maybe even edging up to make it a very close race in New Hampshire. DeSantis is probably going to get around 5%. Ramaswamy, if he's still in the race after Iowa, and same for DeSantis, I think both of them will get around 5% if they're still in the race. If not, I think that a lot of their support could go to Trump for both of those candidates. And in South Carolina, I think as of right now, Trump's looking at around 50%. I think Haley's looking at around 30%. DeSantis, if he's still in the race, which would be extraordinarily unlikely, barring an incredible overperformance in Iowa, I think that he'll get around 5 to 7%, and Ramaswamy even less than that. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.